It is an honor and a privilege for me to welcome the speaker for today's session, Dr. Vinod Thomas, visiting professor, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, and the chair for today's session, Dr. Ajit Menon, professor, Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai. The topic for today's session is climate change and environment. I now request Dr. Punita, the associate professor, Department of Economics, Dean of Student Affairs, Stella College, to welcome the speakers with a bouquet and ponade. And I request Dr. Punita to welcome the chairperson with a bouquet and ponade. Now, Dr. Millie Nihila, Associate Professor, Head, Center for Women's Studies, Stella College, would be introducing the chairperson for today's session.
Good afternoon. I am happy to introduce Dr. Ajit Menon, Professor at Madras Institute of Development Studies. Dr. Menon is a political economist. He graduated from Williams College, USA, and mastered from University of Sussex, UK. His area of interest is political economy of natural interest conflict, or political ecology in the wider context of development, environment discourses and environmental policy shaped by a particular material practices and priorities. He also works on social and political constraints that have differential impact across the social groups and economic classes. His research is primarily aimed at understanding how and when the environment becomes important and the contestation, both material and ontological, that underlies the conflict over the environment in general and commons in practical. He is interested in a collaborative research across disciplines and the epistemological challenge of such research. He has received L.M. Singhvi Fellow from the Center of South Asian Studies, Cambridge. He has published more than 30 articles in both national and international journals. He has co-authored 2 books, and he has half a dozen people working under him for their PhD. And he is a field-based researcher and an eminent scholar.
Okay, good morning. So it's my, thank you anyway for that introduction. Can you hear me? I'm getting an echo. But, okay, so it's my honor to chair this session and to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Vinod Thomas, who's currently a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore. And he also just told me that he's also a visiting faculty at the Asian Institute of Management at Manila. He previously worked with the Asian Development Bank and was responsible for evaluating policies, programs, projects, and technical assistance at the regional level for the ADB. He also, prior to that, worked as the Director General and Senior Vice President of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank, and was formerly Country Director for Brazil, which is what stuck out to me when I read his biodata, a nice country to be the country director for. And he's written a popular book entitled From Within Brazil as well. And prior to that, I think from 1976 onwards, he's spent his time at the World Bank and has held various positions, including that of Chief Economist for the East Asia and Pacific region, Chief of Trade Policy and Principal Economist for Colombia and economist for Bangladesh. Just briefly, I'll tell you about his academic background. He's studied in Mar Ivanios College in Tirunanthapuram in Kerala, and then did his BA in economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, prior to going on and getting a PhD in urban economics from the University of Chicago. He's also taught at Vassar College, New York, and at the University of Sao Paulo, and has authored a number of books on topics such as climate change, development economics, poverty, inequality, and so on and so forth. He also writes extensively in the popular press, in newspapers such as Business Times, The Guardian, and other such papers. I think that's all I'll say at this point of time. I won't keep you from the speaker. He's going to speak on development under climate disasters. He'll speak for a maximum of about 40 minutes, and then my understanding is the floor will be open for discussion, which I'll moderate, but I think that's the important part of any session, having a good discussion on the topic that's going to be spoken about. So without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajit, Dr. Millie, and all present here today. A very good morning. Great pleasure for me to be able to talk to you today. Is the audio okay? Are you able to hear properly? Or sort of reflection? Yeah? A bit away maybe? Okay. We have PowerPoint presentation, so you will be able to see as well as hear me as we go along. It's really very good that the college is organizing this forum. Very timely. The various sessions are wonderful. My only frustration is that I cannot be at the other session where a good friend of mine, Jeff Hammer, is speaking on health. But the health issues are very closely related to the climate issues, as we will see. In the interest of time, let me just jump straight to the topic, which is to motivate us from thinking of natural disasters as unpredictable, occasional, random events that we react to once they happen, as opposed to anticipating them, thinking of them as preventable to some extent, not just the hand of God, but also acts of human beings for which we can take action. And that's where the climate link comes in. When you talk about the global risks today, recently we had the Global Economic Forum. This is the Davos event of the top CEOs of the world as well as leaders of countries. And the whole event starts, and you can see the report online, with this picture, and you cannot see what is behind it, but it's commonplace in every country, but especially developing countries because of the industrial transition that they are going to. Now, a bit more scientifically, the question was put to the leaders about the greatest challenges facing humankind. So every year, picture like this appears. I know you cannot probably see it very well, but let me just say that there are 4 quadrants. Okay? Here we would be measuring the likelihood, that's the probability that a bad thing would happen, right? So as you go down this axis, the higher the number, the greater the chance that this will happen. And along here we measure the impact or the consequence or the damage or the hardship that would result if that probability were to materialize. So it's a combination of something going wrong and how bad the consequences that would give us the risk concern. So where would you really not like to be? environmentalist, but it is a mainstream issue that's of interest to economists and other social scientists concerned with policy. We can come back to that depending on time. If you have questions on this, those of you who are doing work in this area, it would be interesting to drill down. How do you measure the chance of something going wrong? How do you have some confidence about that probability? And then how do you measure the impact of something going wrong? And how do you combine them? Do you multiply them? Do you add them? Do you have coefficients to the terms you add? How do you come up? And do you have confidence in what you're saying? And can you convince policymakers that your conclusions are serious and they are to be taken? And where do you get the data? So we can talk about that if you like. But in the interest of time, let me keep going. And here to make just one point, that the environmental issue that is very much embedded in the previous graph is very much a social issue. It's not a purely environmental issue. So if you look at such a picture, this common ground is getting bigger and bigger. And one of the main reasons is that nearly 75% of rural poor depend on environmental and natural capital wealth for their well-being. So if that's destroyed, it affects poverty right away. And so just for half a minute, if you think of economic growth economics that drives a lot of the work in economics, we used to think of physical and financial capital, investing in them as a big deal. And we rightly also brought in the human capital. That is, economic growth that is here is spurred by not only physical capital, but also by human capital. And that was a very important breakthrough. But the point I would like to add today is that, like a tripod of a camera, you need all three, the natural capital as well. So in the policy discussions about economic growth, much of it is about how to promote the physical and financial capital through special measures. And rightly, and thank God, some of the effort is also on investing in people, education, health. The other session we have right now is an example of that. But on the natural capital, not only is there not investment, but what you have is disinvestment, because we are running down the natural capital. So the tripod, two legs, one leg is fairly strong, the second one is getting attention, but the third one is getting shortened and shortened as we go along. So that lopsided picture will certainly affect growth and well-being. So this is very much a bread and butter central issue for economics. It is again not a peripheral issue. Now, again, to motivate this and to link it to our real world, what brings them together is that when you think of basic needs, food, water, and energy are clearly top of the list. And these three in a nexus, you can imagine food affected by the floods and droughts. Right now, the drought situation is an illustration in Tamil Nadu of what can be the cost of that. And equally, that is affected and related to the water. So the old approaches of providing access is now overtaken so heavily, especially in India, by the depletion of groundwater. And then you have how irrigation, which affects food production, is hurt by the changing water situation. And then we connect that slowly through the hydro to energy, and clearly needed, and hydro is cleaner than coal, but how you do hydro and how you can do less of coal affects how well energy is produced, and this relates to the climate situation I will comment on. Now, this talk is really not very much on India's food challenges, but just to make the connection that among the countries of the world, especially with India's income per capita, the quality of the food situation is a huge concern, particularly for children. And that should surprise us, and that's also one that should concern us. So that point in the nexus remains a huge question for India. And the water situation, as I alluded to, the water table itself is a matter of great concern for India. And when you come to the energy, the third part of the nexus, it's not just an India issue to the extent that it relates to climate change. We need low-cost energy, clearly, but we need to do that in a way that also makes the three forms of capital that I talked about at the beginning balanced. So, can you see at the back the table? Can you see the table at the back? More or less. Okay, I'll explain a bit as we go along. So, from energy production, depending on the sources, whether it's fossil fuels, which is coal, natural gas, and so on, or renewables or hydro, its impact on carbon emissions are going to be high or low. So we clearly would like to have low carbon impact. But sometimes you can't help it because you are rich in coal, you are not so rich in renewables. So here is a picture. India has a relatively low footprint in terms of carbon impact that is emerging from the heavy use of coal, just because India is a lower income economy than, let's say, for the United States. Per person, the biggest emitter right now would be the US, the biggest emitter of carbon. As a total, not per person, so obviously with the population taken into account, the biggest emitter would be China. So when you get into a discussion who is responsible or who is causing the greatest damage in terms of emissions, you could take the view, well, it should be the total because the country controls the total. So China has the largest footprint in that sense. If you could say, well, it should be per person, how much a person is contributing, then the biggest contributor would be the US. There could be a third definition which is not there, not to confuse too much. That would be not per person, not the total per population, but per amount of GDP or activities, economic activities that the economy has. That also makes sense, right? If you have a very high carbon to GDP ratio, that means you are doing it in a very inefficient way and you want to improve yourself. So that actually makes sense. If you use that index, who might be the worst? So that happens to be Russia among the big countries. So the one that is producing with less than efficient energy, ranging from everywhere to losses in energy, electricity, etc., to just very, very old style production modes will give you that result. So anyway, you will have these slides. Any of these could feed into your research interests in the future. But now I'm going to jump straight to the question. We've traced the food, we've traced the water, and we've traced the energy. It's the energy part that is most closely related to climate because it emits carbon. And the question is, with that carbon emission, are we convinced or are we even suspicious that there is a climate impact? Not that the climate is not changing, but it's not changing because of the way we live, right? That's a very tough thing to establish. But in this picture, we right away see, those of you who are into statistics, you'll be excited when you see graphs like that, because what is rising here, this blue line, steadily, is the carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration. It's been just going up steadily, right? And along with that, also rising, not so steadily, but if you did a 3-year moving average or 5-year moving average, it will also look the same, like a glove. They fit like a glove, is the global temperature. So when you see that, oh my God, the connection is so close, but it doesn't right away establish causality, correct? It just says that the two go together. A and B go together. Doesn't mean A causes B. It could be that B causes A. But in this case, it would be unthinkable that global warming is causing carbon emissions. So your suspicion is always the other way around in this example. But you can imagine many situations like, okay, the other session that's going on in the health area. Suppose you see communities with a lot of illnesses, and in those communities you obviously have more doctors and nurses working. So the two go together. But you would not conclude, maybe sometimes you would, but mostly you would not conclude that doctors and nurses cause the illness, right? So in the same way, this gives us a big suspicion, this picture, but the causality remains a question mark. Now in this picture, which again may be difficult to read from the back, I'll just summarize the point. The greens and the blacks here, they are more the geophysical phenomenon, which is like earthquakes, volcanoes. And then the ones on top, the blues and the purples, they are the hydrometeorological and climatological close to it. So hydro is water, so Chennai floods right there. Meteorological, the 2016, more the storms, they are there. And then climatological, the 2017-18 drought is right there. The ones that have been rising are those three, not the geophysical ones. So ask, why? These are all God-given phenomena. Why do some rise in the last 50 years and the others don't? So that should get you going. And that's what we did in the paper, to see, does this really tell us something more about the suspicion that we had? In this talk today, I won't go into the econometric findings, but just to say that we found very strong relationship between flood, storms and so on the one side and the emission of carbons on the other, holding some of the other factors steady. So in the case of Tamil Nadu, let's think about the 2015 situation. So by now we have had lots of papers, a lot of popular literature and lots of other papers which talk about what went wrong, what happened. So you have some of the explanations in terms of governance, the changes in the way the state was organized and managed at that time. We have many explanations in terms of the water, channeling of the water, the control of the water, the weeds even in the tanks and all the rest that made flooding a problem. And then the encroachment and where people lived and so on, leading to the damages that they caused. So the question is, will the explanation stop there? If you believe in some of the things I was saying earlier, then there is a further point to be explored. Was the water coming from the rains themselves a problem? In other words, you're prepared for an intermediate exam, and suddenly at the last minute, somehow switched it on you, and you're given an advanced test. So you did well, you did okay, but you did terribly in terms of the actual exam that you were given. So if the floods were the results also of the water levels being 3 times the average for that time period, then you have to ask, wow, is this something in addition to all the other factors I mentioned that we need to keep in mind? In this case, it so happens that indeed it was 3 times, and the same picture repeats itself in several countries, including the United States, in the last 2 or 3 years. We should talk a lot more about this in our discussion period, how you explain the extreme hardships and deaths over 500 in the kind of event that we saw in Tamil Nadu, but repeated in both rich and poor countries all over. Perhaps another 10 minutes and I will close. So I mentioned rich countries, so there was a thinking at one point, if climate change is a reality, should you worry about that? Well, the reason people do not worry about it is oftentimes we think it's in the distant future, but the things I'm mentioning are from 2015, 16 and 17, so that's not the case. The other reason is often given is that it's happening in faraway places. We think of the Pacific Islands and so on. But here is the United States right here, where you can see the California floods, fires. And why did that happen? Just like the Tamil Nadu episode of 2015, people have done work already. And the explanations go all the way from, well, there was a cooking stove inappropriately left and it caught fire. That's approximate reason. Matches were here and there a problem, and so on and so forth. But the underlying reason, whether the warming of the air and the dryness, and in this case, it's a question for you. Later on you can see whether you want to pursue this. The combination of too much water and too much dryness is a problem too. That is, in the first half of the year, it was very wet, and so the bushes grew very lusciously. And then when the dryness happened, there were a lot of bushes that became dry. So they were extremely vulnerable. So the combination was a killer. But this graph shows how the temperature has been rising in California, and the extreme here. You see above average. The darkest spots also happen to be in California. So, in a nutshell, coming back to the previous discussion of the social, and then now we introduce the climate, I'm thinking of the two sets of factors as a combination rather than it's one or the other. So this picture from the United Nations, ICDCI, makes that point that if you think of a disaster like the 2015 floods in Tamil Nadu, in this whole South India region, the disaster risk clearly is signaling a red flag. And there are three sets of things that we need to worry about. One is the exposure of the people, that encroachment point. Where are people living? More and more people in harm's way. The second, the vulnerability. That is, if the bridges and the tanks and the river systems are not capable of dealing with it, that is a problem. So you are more vulnerable. And then the pure hazard, what I said, 3 times the water you are used to from rain in the given month of November, mid to December, mid 2015. So the three combined seem to be behind what's happening. So an incredible topic would be if you can attribute to the three factors, are they somewhat equally distributed, or are they very different, or one dominates, and does it depend on which region? Regardless of all of that, there is a question, of course, of what are you going to do about it, right? So if the 2015 situation repeated in 2019, would the response be better on all those points that we talked about? Governance, the engineering, the logistics, human settlement and encroachment, and the zoning, the whole area related to that. Plus, not much you can do. Tamil Nadu can't do much about the climate mitigation, but India can and the rest of the world can. So, whatever it is, there is a disaster management question that we have to deal with. And here, of course, there are two parts to that. There is the recovery, which is the one that we focus on most heavily. So it is the emergency things that one has to do. So most of the time after a disaster strikes, the discussion is about how well did we manage post-disaster. And then there is the disaster management, that's the preparedness.